operate in strictest secrecy at the cutting edge of Australia's defence. They're creative, unorthodox and comfortable in chaos. For over 50 years, the Australian SAS has put their lives at risk, deep behind enemy lines. This is the only television history ever supported by this highly secretive regiment. We take you beyond the stereotypes to reveal the unexpected story of the real people who transformed SAS from the ugly duckling of the Australian Army into pride of place as Australia's force of first choice. In the 1980s and 90s, SAS had added black CT skills to its green war skills. Its long-term viability seemed assured. But SAS now faced a complex crisis from within. After 2 decades without major combat operations, SAS was losing its flair for the unorthodox. Yet unconventional thinking is both the oxygen and raison d'etre of SAS. Government would have no need for an expensive SAS that was conventional.
The purpose of SAS is to provide non-conventional military solutions to military problems. What was clear to us at SAS at the time was the world was changing and we had to form a view about what SAS would do and the role it would play in that changed environment.
A paradigm shift to instinctive unorthodoxy was needed urgently. To Major Jim Truscott, 3 Squadron Operations Officer, SAS was heading in the wrong direction.
I, in many respects, was a bit of a change agent in SASR, partly because that's the sort of guy I am, partly because that was one of my job statements to do it. And I was trying to take SASR kicking and screaming into the next century against a lot of opposition. For an organisation that is such of creative, high-tempo guys, sometimes it's like there's a machine spinning like this, but it's spinning in the wrong direction. And I called it learned helplessness or skilled incompetence. And we were perpetuating skills which I believed were less relevant. And we needed to kick this machine this way. And I was doing a lot of that.
Truscott knew that the soldier who detects new paradigms early and exploits the period of uncertainty and paralysis while they are still forming will succeed. But preaching paradigm change to talented SAS individualists was frustrating.
And if you're a change manager, they don't accept what he's saying. Change leaders, change navigators come to be hated. And I could see that in doing what I did, I was starting to outgrow SAS.
Historically, politics and paradigm change collide. In 1633, the powerful Catholic Church still based its authority on the old Ptolemaic Aristotelian paradigm of a geocentric universe, with mankind and the earth at the centre of God's creation, and the sun and planets orbiting reverently around it. But Galileo proved the Copernican paradigm, a heliocentric universe where the Earth orbited around the sun. He thought he would only have to explain it logically to Pope Barberini, and the Church would embrace the new paradigm. Alas, no. Galileo was talking scientific proof, but the Pope was talking power politics. Barberini threatened Galileo with the dreaded Inquisition, which gave him a stark choice: recant his ideas or burn at the stake. Galileo recanted. Crucially, paradigm shifts determine new realities. In warfare, the use of cavalry, the inventions of gunpowder, the Gatling machine gun, the aeroplane, the submarine, and the atomic bomb transformed warfare by changing strategic paradigms. In World War II, if Japan's Emperor Hirohito had immediately responded to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima as a paradigm shift, then the atomic bombing of Nagasaki a week later might not have occurred. The lesson for SAS is a constant. Anticipating new paradigms and exploiting uncertainty and doubt during paradigm change can mean victory or defeat, survival or extinction. Paradigm change managers are always several leaps ahead.
The threat is changing. What we now see is we do not see traditional threats to sovereignty anymore. You know, there's going to be no mass invasions of Australia. If it will be, it'll be insidious threats like foot and mouth disease or the current drug war, which kills 1,000 people a year in Australia. It's an undeclared war. Or transnational crime, which is now impacting across Southeast Asia, where you see countries like North Korea supporting criminal intent as part of their destabilisation of regimes which are different to them. So it'll be up to the Australian government to combat these threats, and in many cases, uniformed SAS with weapons, totally inappropriate. So I see the need for what I call corporate commandos, where the majority of these asymmetric threats will be defeated by soldier businessmen, whereby the best form of defeating these threats won't be with the weapon, at least not with metallic weapons, maybe ceramic weapons.
In SAS in the 1990s, paradigm change would need not only informed leadership, but also facts, logic and consensus, confronting cultures of conventionality and habit with creativity and unconventionality.
The future for SAS clearly lays in national special operations. There's a big difference between special forces and special operations. The bulk of what special forces do are really quite ordinary, conventional operations. And indeed, as the Army modernises, a lot of things that SF used to do are just becoming mainstream conventional tasks.
In 1995, incoming CO Mike Silverstone found the problem more widespread than first thought.
On my arrival at SAS and following discussions with a range of people there, I formed the view that not only had the counter-terrorist capability become increasingly conventional, but indeed the unit and its broad approach to the way it provided its services and capabilities was also at risk of becoming increasingly conventional. The first step on arrival, I had the squadron commanders and the squadron sergeant majors read the book Bravo 20, the story of a military operation in Iraq during the first Gulf War by 22 SAS. My main interest in having them read that book was to look at that in terms of the challenges for planning operations and the lessons that were available from some of the less successful aspects of that particular military operation.
Bravo 20 is the true story of a bungled patrol by Britain's SAS in the Iraqi War. It lost 2 men due to poor planning and an overconfident attitude to desert survival and extreme weather. Silverstone decided that the writing was on the wall for complacency in SAS. Individual creativity was found wanting.
I used to quote Yogi Berra, his quote about the future when he said, "The future ain't what it used to be."
He decided to change how the regiment was doing business, and to make us think outside the square and outside the box, and to focus so we'd be the force of choice in the future.
And he just came in and laid it out and said, "We can do it better. I think there's something wrong with it. It's just not working for me." That's all he said. He's talking directly that culture of excellence, of elite approaches that people have. And now hackles went up. All of us thought, what do you mean? We're not good enough. We're not doing what we should be doing. And so it started a great period of angst, you know, introspection, and we questioned everything.
Mike Silverstone made good use of the lateral thinking theories of the time and desired that every SAS soldier obtain a university degree. The academic field didn't matter. It was the enhanced reasoning and divergent thinking acquired through study that was paramount.
At that time, the things out were total quality management, De Bono's lateral thinking, all that, and he wanted to bring that in the regiment. He wanted us to be in the 21st century, leading edge special forces unit, not only in Australia but within the world. So he threw a whole lot of sticks up in the air to see where they'd land. And there was a lot of change, and a lot of guys didn't like the change and moved on.
Shifting to a new paradigm means that the world not only looks different, it is different. SAS was on the road to becoming that rare but priceless entity, the truly postmodern organisation, highly flexible, astutely self-critical, and gaining advantage by exploiting the stasis of paradigm change. Conventional hierarchies can easily become dysfunctional when faced with new ideas.
In order to develop our capacity for non-conventionality, we decided to move to what was called relaxed dress standards, not wearing uniforms, growing their hair, and if they had authorisation to have personal jewellery such as earrings and the like.
They allowed things as guys with their long hair, growing beards, wearing earrings, coming to work, more flexible work hours and such things like that, which some people said that was going too far, and they actually have pulled back from that. It was a trial thing, but it made people think outside the square.
We started to slaughter some of the sacred cows as we went along. For example, Morse code. Morse code was something that's fundamental to a patrol signaller or any of the signallers, and that's how we used to communicate in the bush. With the advent of satellite technology, Morse code had become long since irrelevant, you know, into the early 90s, yet we still kept it into that sacred cow of training, our training system. And I remember the great anxiety that spread through the unit when it was finally decided to say, we don't do Morse anymore.
So he designed a way to break the mould of what we're doing, and he instigated 3 projects. Project Ulysses, which looked at education, Project Emilio, which looked at broadening people's world experiences, and Project Veritas, which is a psychological screening of people to get a baseline of who was in the regiment and what personality traits they had to then develop.
That's what we want.
The journey was better than the destination, because in that consistent and continual questioning of ourselves, we understood that renewal is the thing that's important, not the actual end result of it.
First of all was Project Emilio, in which we would seek to create chaotic environments to which we could expose our junior NCOs and evolving leaders, so that they would be shifted from their comfort zone and develop some sense of awareness of the potential environment they might see on combat operations. We partially funded 2 soldiers to travel to India, through Kashmir, and then up into China as tourists, moving east across the country before finally emerging in Laos.
We were in the Indian subcontinent for about 3 months, through Pakistan up into China, Peshawar, where those border areas are between Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Swat Valley, that kind of area. And the old Silk Route we basically followed up to Western China, border crossing at Tashkurgan. But that particular area was very, very dangerous at times. Some of those mountain passes were subject to falling rocks. The roads were not good. It was not unusual for a bus to fall off a cliff whilst it was driving those routes. One day, particularly for me and John, was a pretty dangerous day where we had to navigate our way through one of those rock slides, and we're talking about boulders as big as cars rolling down a hill, and in one instance just missing us by a couple of feet. So they come flying down, and often you don't see them until they're almost on top of you. And it was freezing as well up there at the time, so we're carrying our packs, quite heavy packs, and there's no support up there, so if something happens then there's no evacuation procedure. You have to try and find some locals to try and carry you back to the nearest town. But I guess that was the intent of the whole project, was to put people out of their comfort zone and into those uncertain environments. As with any new boss that comes in with new ideas, the older soldiers will always look at it with a sceptical point of view. His ideas were definitely a little different to previous COs, but I think on the whole the project was embraced, and I guess an example of that is that project is still ongoing today at the regiment. They did make exercises increasingly more challenging and unusual, so that soldiers would be presented, I guess, with situations that you would not normally get from a regular exercise.
In reforming SAS, Silverstone identified patrol commanders as the most important soldiers in SAS. It was their decisions during missions that determined the performance profile of the entire SAS.
And one of the things I learned very early on is that the rest of the Army works on a positive and negative feedback. So if I do something wrong in a conventional Army unit, I'll get yelled at, or sternly talked to, or punished in some way. If I do something well, there'll be certificates and parades and all sorts of things that will flow from it. But in SAS, it's not like that. The culture in SAS is something that's worked on an understatement. There would be no overt reinforcement, because negative reinforcement also assists somebody, because they can shoulder against it and say, well, I'm going to show you, you bastard. But if we remove those crutches that they traditionally find in the rest of the Army, we find that we are actually getting close to the essence of what SAS leadership style is. Nothing reinforces authority greater than silence, and often you would see people who would just say nothing and get great results from saying nothing. It's a very interesting dynamic. You don't see it in any other defence force, and I haven't seen it in many other civil organisations since I've been out.
We were determined that we should become the force of first choice for the ADF and government in future military operations. In order to deliver that, we decided that we need to demonstrate that we're reliable and had safe hands.
This spring cleaning of SAS problem-solving skills helped prepare the SAS to become the major strategic resource of an Australian government faced with a volatile Asia-Pacific region.
SAS in the early and mid-90s started to get increasingly involved in overseas activities. In addition to the regional engagement training activities we did for countries around our region, we also started to get involved in some of the operations, particularly peacekeeping operations, such as those conducted in Somalia and to a lesser extent in Cambodia.
To forestall possible conflict, SAS specifically courted its Special Forces counterparts in Indonesia and Southeast Asia.
The royalty of the Southeast Asian armies is their Special Forces, and to belong to the Special Forces in one of these armies is considered particularly important, and in fact some of those cabinet appointments in Indonesia have been filled by Kopassus officers, which is the Indonesian Special Forces. Regional engagement is a good example of how the government can use the Defence Force generally, and SAS specifically, for the prosecution or pursuit of its foreign policy regionally. That was something that was really developed particularly through the early 90s.
Two excellent examples of the benefit of these relationships was Mike Jeffrey's foresight in having Prabowo, the son-in-law of Suharto, train in Australia, and also the fact that Duncan Lewis had been the defence attaché in Indonesia and therefore had relationships which were brought to great benefit in his time in Timor with the UN force.
Okay, first thing we're going to do is strip the weapon. So carry out individual safety precautions and strip the weapon.
At times, this training was controversial. After Kopassus officers were convicted of killing West Papuan pro-independence leader Taze Elaway, The Australian press accused SAS of teaching foreign forces skills for suppressing political dissent.
Now, SAS doesn't really have a choice in terms of the type of training that can be conducted. It's quite tightly controlled by our own government policy in terms of that type of training. So it is confined essentially to hostage recovery. We are not to train these countries or their special forces units in any type of skill that could be used internally against their own people in a counterinsurgency mode.
In the same way that visits by our naval ships to foreign ports helps our foreign relations and our political relationships, our involvement with the special forces of other countries also helps Australia's political engagement with our friends and neighbours. It's very important.
Right angle, fellas.
But whether overseas or at home, SAS training has to mimic real combat situations, and so is often dangerous. The Rock at SAS Swanbourne lists the names of all SAS soldiers who have died. Most of these deaths have been through training. In June 1996, the new flexibility and resilience of the regiment was suddenly tested.
At the end of 1995 was when the squadron took over the counter-terrorist responsibility. One of the first exercises we did was flying up to Townsville and spent a week or 10 days there doing roping and rappelling out of helicopters and target assaults and that sort of thing. And then in June of 1996, went back up to Townsville for the second of our exercises that involved the Black Hawk helicopters as a primary method of insertion. We were focusing on an offshore recovery, and then it came for the fourth run through of the day was a night run. We'd finished dinner just as the sun was going down. We boarded the helos and flew off to the start point and continued the run-in from there.
The pilots of the 6 Black Hawk helicopters were wearing night vision goggles, flying at low level to deliver the SAS CT teams right onto their target. The 3 Black Hawks in front were flying line abreast.
The blood's pumping. It's like everything's just brilliantly highlighted. Everything you're doing is right there. You know what you're doing, you know what needs to be done. You're just solely focused on the job. And then as far as that night was concerned, all of a sudden it was turned upside down. Everything just turned to shit. The main rotors on Black Hawk 1 severed the tail rotor on Black Hawk 2, which caused it, and the pilot was able to auto-rotate that and take it to the ground upright. But when it hit with that much force that all the motor and transmission in the roof came down through and ended up killing a fair number of boys, or 8 of the boys in the back of that helo. Black 1, having lost its tail rotor, we inverted and just speared straight into the ground from about 80 feet. And 11 of the 13 guys in Black 1 perished. That's probably one of my last conscious memories, and that was sort of the lurch and the fuel lines pretty well ignited, instantly as far as that was concerned.
There were small explosions going off. It was a live fire exercise, so there were weapons were cooking off. There were bullets firing. These guys stayed in there as long as they could to try and get as many people out as they could.
They managed to drag most of the bodies out of the aircraft that night. From what I gather, I was one of the last they managed to get out. Initially, they couldn't find any signs of life on me, and to drag me up the hill there and left me with the rest of the bodies. And Mick Williams was a good mate of mine at the time, and he'd actually come back to say goodbye and was holding me, and I either gurgled or I did something, and he realised that, you know, I wasn't quite dead. So they got me onto the aircraft and got me back to Townsville General Hospital.
The initial call had advised me that some 3 or 4 soldiers looked to have perished. By the time I arrived at SAS, 20 minutes later, the figure was almost double. As it came to pass, God had put in the officers' mess that night the chaplains of Western Australia for a dinner that they were enjoying with each other after a sabbatical that they'd had for a few days. I went down to the officers' mess, asked the chaplains to join me quickly at the regiment headquarters, and on a whiteboard we listed their denominations, their backgrounds, and we linked them with a young officer from SAS and a soldier or an officer who had known the deceased. And for the next 12 hours, those chaplains and the members of the regiment knocked on the doors and advised partners that their partners had perished in far north Queensland.
The thing that amazed me, and has stuck in my mind forever, is that a number of the widows of the newly deceased soldiers came to the sergeant's mess that night to greet the survivors and to say to the surviving soldiers and their next of kin how pleased they were that they had survived. It was one of the most braveless and selfless demonstrations of regimental spirit and esprit and caring and compassion that I've ever witnessed anywhere in my life. And it's one of the reasons, I guess, why I supported later on the establishment of an SAS trust to provide a bit more wherewithal to look after dependents and their education of the kids and so on.
They were just amazing. There's something quite magnificent about SAS wives and sadly SAS widows. They're a special breed of woman.
The day before, about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I got a really bad feeling that something was happening around the unit, and I spoke to different people about it, and I couldn't sleep that night, and I got up in the morning about 6 o'clock and I was picked up by an officer, and he asked me, did I hear that we had had a bad accident? And I said no, and then when I walked in here to the mess, I was greeted with some of the wives and all the boys, and it was just wonderful how they were all rallying around for one another, and that's when I realised this was a special, special place.
The Black Hawk crash on the 10th of June 1996 was a terrible event. Terrible in terms of the 15 soldiers from the regiment who were killed and the others who were injured. Terrible in terms of the consequences for the long-term effect of many of those who were present on that night. The deaths and injuries carved a hole in the regiment.
For the next 2 weeks it was just full on. I had 9 funerals go past my office, 2 a day. And apart from that, I was also dealing with the families. We were flying families in from all over Australia. We even flew a mother in from the US. We had visits from all the politicians. We had people arriving at the gate just wanting to give us stuff and teddy bears for the kids.
I can recall looking into the faces of several of the children, 2 or 3 of the children who had just been orphaned. I think the name was Ben, and there were a couple of others. And I looked at them in the face and said, you and your families have just suffered a tremendous loss. But in time to come, as you get older, when people ask you what your dad did, you'll be able to say, my dad was an SAS soldier.
As an officer in charge of that, I accept and obviously had a significant amount of responsibility in with that. The defence system, the military ethos and the unit ethos is that one doesn't shirk from that responsibility. So that will be something that is there with me, with those others who are in responsible positions for the rest of our lives.
As a result of that accident, along with the spinal cord damage at T56, the thoracic region, I also wound up with the gloving injury on my left elbow, left broken humerus in 8 places, broken scapula, broken pelvis, which required external fixators to pull it back together, a shattered left knee, full thickness burns from the ankle to the hip on my left leg, and brachial plexus nerve damage, which is where the nerves come out of your neck and spread down your arm, and radial, medial and ulnar nerve damage down the left arm. You know, my lump sum entitlement for all my injuries was, or the maximum entitlement was $200,000, of which I was actually only entitled to $110,000 because I didn't actually die. So, whereas there are a couple of guys that worked in the mines that were in the spinal unit at the same time as me, and their entitlement was about $110,000, but then they had the option to take a civil action, and both of them left the hospital with a payout of, you know, in excess of $2.5 million, whereas, you know, $110,000 was all I was entitled to.
Salute. Morning.
The outcomes of the Board of Inquiry resulted in a decision to seek to court-martial the OC of 1 Squadron, Major Bob Hunter and Captain Sean Bellis. In my view, the decision was without merit and without a sound basis in law, and indeed ultimately not sustained by an assessment of the facts, and the court-martials were not pursued.
At worst, it tended to proportion blame, and it proportioned it down onto individuals. And in doing that, the notion of shared responsibility seemed to have been lost. They looked at what had occurred on this particular training exercise, and I think it lost context. This wasn't recklessness or foolishness by individuals or a squadron doing training that was inappropriate. This was developing a capability to be able to save the lives of Australian nationals that might be taken hostage, where you needed to use the capabilities of Black Hawk aircraft to get in very quickly, to dominate an area and put troops between the hostages and the terrorists. So there was risk. And it's interesting to note that there was no criticism from any of the squadron, no criticism from within the regiment, and the regiment can be a very harsh place on group and individual actions, because that's how it develops. And there was no criticism proportioned to any individuals or that squadron, and nor was it, to my knowledge, by any of the families that sat through that investigation.
Nevertheless, it is sad that 2 outstanding officers were driven from the Australian Army.
As a result of the Black Hawk disaster, we were seen to be punished and we were put back under land command. We were seen to be just ordinary ground troops again. I see it as a tragic missed opportunity for special operations to be taken out of the defence fiefdom and be truly made a whole of government capability, reporting to, you know, Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet or some other interagency task force.
Just managing the whole thing was quite difficult at the time, and I think we pulled together as a team, the whole regiment that is, but the regiment had to get back on with it.
I've got to say I was pretty amused by some of the rhetoric and some of the media. Amused is probably the wrong word, I'd say annoyed, that the implication was there that the morale of the regiment was shot, that we'd been gutted by the whole experience and totally lost our focus, you know, operationally and so forth. And if you speak to all the diggers who were around and about in the regiment at that time, and I spoke to a number of them, their main response was geez, that was tragic, but thank God it wasn't me, and let's move on, you know. And that's what they did. The impact from a morale point of view was negligible, seriously negligible. Now, I'm not saying, and I don't deny that from a next of kin point of view and family point of view, it was absolute tragedy, and that took some time to recover from. But from soldiers remaining in the unit, it did not affect them one bit. From the point of view of the numbers of really high quality soldiers and particular NCOs who were killed in that, that did impact the unit, because it takes you a long time to grow the quality of soldier that resides within the SAS. You know, we had NCOs, patrol commanders, who'd been in the unit 10, 12, 13 years, who were killed in that event. And a whole bunch of young troopers who'd been there 5 or 6 years, who were the future of that organisation. Now, 15 of them is a not insignificant number.
I did end up going back to work fairly early in the year in 1997, only for 2, 3, 4 hours a day type thing. Despite my injuries, I was actually still able to get down the back and shoot with the boys, albeit just static shooting at the range down the back there. And it was something that I never realised until it was only a few years back that one of the guys sort of pointed out to me, but there was always somebody tasked to stand there just in case, it all got the better of me and I decided to turn the gun on myself. There was something inside me that wouldn't let myself go down that path, and I think part of that was the fact that for whatever reason it was that I'd survived, if I was to check out by doing that, I'd be letting down those mates of mine that had died in the crash. So they can't live their life anymore, but if I live mine to the best of my ability, it's in recognition of them and their efforts.
In 1998, Iraq invaded Kuwait and America intervened.
At very short order, we were committed to Kuwait. It was a bit like the phony Gulf War, where Saddam Hussein was starting to ratchet up the propaganda war against the Americans and the Brits, and the Australian government committed us as part of a multinational task force should America want to go and bomb.
The Australian government, keen to support its powerful American ally, sent a 100-man SAS squadron to Kuwait. This was not a small niche operation, but a major deployment.
The SAS commitment to Kuwait back in 1998 was known as Operation Pollard, and in fact it was the first major deployment of SAS overseas at that point since Vietnam. But its main focus and role was to provide what we call combat search and rescue to the US in particular, and specifically recovering downed pilots. American pilots who were conducting operations into Iraq, maybe get shot down and parachute out. Our job was to move in and recover these pilots, which was strategically and politically very important to the United States, given what had happened in Somalia not long before, where you saw the visions of pilots being dragged through the streets.
I firstly found myself inside Kuwait within about 3 or 4 days after the political clearance was given. The squadron quickly followed, and there was a period of intense operational activity for a couple of weeks before Saddam Hussein was quite successful in defeating America through the war of words. And we went from an operational posture back to a barrack posture within a couple of months.
In the air-conditioned US base in the Kuwaiti desert, SAS soldiers were surrounded by a vast store of US military technology. This highlighted different perspectives about the role of technology on the battlefield.
One of the great attributes and strengths of the SAS soldier is that he does apply basic skills very effectively. He still understands the importance of basic skills, and by basic skills I'm talking about, the ability to be able to navigate with a compass and a map, as opposed to a global positioning system, a GPS, or being able to use HF radio, high frequency radio, as opposed to what we call fast food radio with tactical satellite radio. All those sorts of basic skills on the one hand versus the high-tech capability on the other hand. The danger is, of course, and this has been proven, that technology is not always reliant. Technology, if it falls over and we don't have the basic skills to fall back upon, means that generally the operation and the mission will fall over as well. And that's what really does set Australian Special Forces, Australian SAS, aside from many of its counterparts.
The squadron was relieved by another squadron in reduced size, and within, I think, about 5 months, our commitment had ceased. So we didn't fire a shot in anger, but it was again a demonstration of the speed at which we could be used, largely given the skills that have been developed over the years from our CT role.
By the late 90s, the computer had been established as an integral part of the battle space. SAS quickly mastered the tactics and techniques of information warfare.
I guess a good example of how we were starting to field some of this equipment was in the Joint Task Force 21 trials in late 1998, where we were used to simulate a typical enemy force to allow the rest of the Australian Army in particular to experiment with various models that might be successful in defeating incursions in Northern Australia. So we were tasked to be as realistic as enemy as possible, and while we were constrained in some things and were told to act in a particular way for some aspects, we were able to field an information warfare capability. We were able to use what later became known as red cell concepts or offensive information warfare and target the communications vulnerabilities of our opposing force. Largely it was just good old rat cunning, but we had some equipment which enabled us to retain the edge, the knowledge edge, over our opposing force. It was a very interesting time as we were trying to meld information warfare concepts into classic SAS patrolling. Some examples of the capability were that we were able to find out where all the pilots were living at RAF Tyndall, and we were able to go around and assassinate every one of them. We were able to intercept DSTO aircraft, and we were able to very simplistically eliminate them. We were able to put viruses into battlefield computers and bring down the entire task force system of communications.
In 1997, the Australian SAS regiment had been going for 40 years. The nimble, impudent young troopers of the era of Borneo and Vietnam were now middle-aged.
I left the SAS formally in April '05. I knew from 3 years prior to that, or even longer, that I should start ramping out and thinking about life after the army. I realised that my body was starting to give out, and it's a young man's game. Every appointment up to squadron commander is something that requires a high degree of physical capability, and I could feel in myself that it was gone. After those 20 odd years, it really did take its toll. So I've had arthroscopies on both knees, and one knee twice, and both ankles. I've compressed 2 vertebrae, surgery on my shoulder, surgery on my neck. I've contracted asthma, arguably through the contact with CS gas during the counter-terrorism days. So my list of injuries is less than some, but not unusual in what can be a very aggressive environment.
I was medically discharged in 2005 with multiple injuries, back injuries, neck, knees and ankles. And at that stage I wasn't really sure about what the future was and for me as a person. I wanted to stay in the SASR, and I think my time was probably up as well. I'd moved from squadron to squadrons and been medically downgraded, and it was pretty well writing on the wall as a fighter. My days were done, and it's pretty disheartening for someone to get to that point and not have a plan.
I was discharged from the army, admittedly against my will, on medical grounds in October of 1999, and for probably 12 months, or almost 12 months, I was at a loss of what to do.
It's not a very happy place for a lot of people. They weren't given a good reception when they leave, and unfortunately that's the nature of the beast with the SAS regiment, that whilst you're there, you're very well looked after, you are an integrated member, but once you're no use to them, you are no use. You know, and the saying is, there's nothing more X than an X, and that is so certainly true. That, and it's no fault of the regiments, it's just, as I said, the nature of the beast. You know, they're still going off doing secret missions, and they can't tell you what they're doing, and that's just the way it is.
The stuff that's been the hardest to deal with has certainly been, you know, the emotional and psychological side of things. Because of the sort of work that we've been doing, and I suppose because of your own mental psyche, you know, I always felt that I was above it, you know, I was better than it. It wasn't a real injury, and so I lived in denial for probably the better part of, it was three and a half, nearly 4 years, I suppose, before I got any proper treatment from it. And during that period of time, my marriage dissolved and that sort of thing. There was all the physical injuries being treated and not the mental and psychological side of things.
There is provision in our compensation scheme that says that you know, you can be rehabilitated. So, and they go off to these outside service providers of Department of Veterans Affairs. Now they're good in their own right, but you could be looking at a 40-year-old guy that's been to war 3 times, or you know more, multiple trips to Afghanistan, multiple contacts, you know, and literally, you know, he's a killer, right? That's what he is. And the person that's sitting there interviewing him is a 22-year-old graduate in rehabilitation from one of the universities, and they have no concept of what an SAS guy's capabilities are. None whatsoever. So that in its own right is pretty demeaning.
I became, looking back on it, I was very, very much dependent and reliant on substances to get me through, and medication of choice was Booker's bourbon, so very high alcohol content, almost mother's milk in some respects, but again with the quantities, you know, 4 and 5 bottles a week type thing was, looking back on it, quite excessive, but it made the nights bearable.
We said we've got to do something a little bit more, so we came up with this idea called Project Braithwaite. Project Braithwaite is a rehabilitation initiative for SAS soldiers that have been injured, okay, or anyone who served at the SAS barracks, okay. And the whole concept there is to give them projects to keep them busy while they're on their journey for rehabilitation. It's almost like a transition. Our inaugural project is to get an ex-crayfishing boat, which is underway, and guys can work on that and keep them busy in a peer group environment through the transition of discharging from the military before they can work out what they want to do.
It still kept me in contact with you know, the guys that I had served with and the mates that I had and that sort of thing, and so it was, to me, it was almost like a surrogate type thing. You know, I wasn't in the army, but I still was. I became the treasurer, and for 10 years, and so I'm now the president of the West Australian branch of the association, and the association has probably grown 4 or 5 times as big as it was, you know, when I first came onto the committee.
We're not just there to provide a place to go and get drunk and have a barbecue. We also try and do other things as well, like helping out any veterans who are ill or their widows, or perhaps helping to support the families of the soldiers who are on deployment. We have what we call the SAS checklist. We straight away say to the guys, you know, when did you last have your back x-rayed? Because one of the things that we find amongst SAS soldiers that the skeletons are pretty badly knocked around by this continual business with parachuting and running and doing counter-terrorist work with heavy weights and stuff like that. And so the wear and tear on their bodies is much greater than the normal civilian would experience. Solar problems are another area that we have to counsel them a fair bit in, because they do a lot of work out in the open, like on boats and stuff like that. There is an aftermath to all the super soldier stuff. people are like me. We may not live to be very fit old men, but we'll hopefully live to be old anyway.
The post-1988 concentration on the Asian region meant that we had to make sure we could speak the languages of the region. So we trained people in Thai, in Malay, in Indonesian, also in the Pacific languages, Pidgin and Bislima, which is a Melanesian Pidgin version.
In preparing for Asia, SAS still encountered problems with the Fortress Australia strategic policy.
The need to acquire languages was one example why you need good strategic guidance. You can't suddenly train someone in a language when you're suddenly required to go somewhere. It takes years to get someone efficient in a language. And this is an example of why flawed strategic guidance can have such a bad effect on soldiers. It actually means that instead of the government accepting strategic risk, that strategic risk is transferred to the soldier, because regardless how bad the strategic guidance was, government is still going to require the soldier to go and sort out the trouble.
Trouble would soon revisit the arc of instability. In 1999, serious tensions would loom with Indonesia, Australia's largest near neighbour and the largest Islamic nation in the world. When tiny East Timor sought full freedom from Indonesia, Australia and the United Nations would become involved. SAS would be plunged into a tough test of its strategic effectiveness.